Okay, so you actually sent over the entire Jack Smith report on the 2020 election investigation. This is quite the deep dive.
It is.
We're talking about potential criminal interference at the highest levels here.
Yeah, and you know what's crazy is this is not just some boring legal document.
Right.
This thing reads like a political thriller.
It does.
It really takes you behind the scenes of a pivotal moment in American history.
It's not exactly light reading.
No.
But it's full of these moments that make you feel like you're right there in the Oval Office watching it all go down.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're here. We're going to break down the key findings, the arguments, the evidence.
Love it.
The whole shebang.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's start with the special counsel himself.
Okay.
Jack Smith. He was appointed to oversee this whole investigation, and the report really emphasizes his commitment to being impartial.
Absolutely.
Like, he wasn't on any team.
Yeah. Right out of the gate.
Yeah.
He made it clear he wasn't playing for any team.
Right.
Red or blue.
Yeah.
It was all about following the facts and the law wherever they led.
Right.
And to really drive that point home, he handpicked a team of veteran prosecutors.
Right.
All with squeaky clean reputations.
Yeah, it's like he knew going in that this was going to be a political hot potato.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
With everyone and their mother scrutinizing every move he made.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the central allegation.
Okay.
What exactly is this report claiming that former President Trump did?
So the report alleges that when all of those legal challenges to the 2020 election fizzled out, Mr. Trump didn't just accept the results. Instead, he allegedly engaged in a series of actions aimed at keeping himself in power.
Okay, hold up. What kind of actions are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about putting pressure on state officials to change vote tallies.
Right.
Attempting to create these fake slates of electors.
Right.
Who would vote for him even though he lost the popular vote in their states.
Wow.
And even trying to get Vice President Pence to meddle with the whole certification process.
Whoa. Okay, that's a lot to unpack.
It is.
Does the report give any specific examples of these alleged actions?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
It cites things like Mr. Trump's phone call with Georgia's Secretary of State, where he asked him to find enough votes to swing the election in his favor.
Right.
There are details about his interactions with Michigan lawmakers.
Okay.
And his attempts to install a Justice Department official who would back his claims.
It's like he was trying to pull every lever he could get his hands on.
That's the impression the report gives, yeah.
And one thing that really jumps out at me is this emphasis on deceit.
Yes.
The report argues that knowingly false claims were at the heart of Mr. Trump's alleged strategy.
That's right. And it even goes on to say that advisors and officials flat out told Mr. Trump that his claims were bogus.
Yeah.
But he kept pushing them anyway.
Like when he kept repeating those claims about rigged voting machines in Michigan.
Right.
And massive fraud in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, even though his own people were telling him there was no evidence to back it up.
It really paints a picture of someone determined to overturn the election no matter what the facts were.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And you can't talk about this report without addressing the elephant in the room. The January 6th attack on the Capitol.
Yeah.
The report draws a straight line between Mr. Trump's actions and that fateful day.
It highlights his speech at the Ellipse where he used the word fight over and over again and told his supporters to march on the Capitol.
And then there's his inaction during the riot itself.
Right.
Even when advisors are practically begging him to step in and calm things down.
Right.
He just sat back and watched the chaos unfold.
It's pretty chilling to think about.
It is. It is.
And the report even mentions rioters saying that they were at the Capitol because of Mr. Trump, that he had told them to be there.
Yeah, that he told them to be there.
Okay, so we've got all this alleged misconduct.
Yeah.
What does that mean in legal terms? What specific charges were considered against Mr. Trump?
The report lays out the legal basis for a handful of charges.
Okay.
The big ones are conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of an official proceeding, and conspiracy to injure the right to vote.
Whoa, those are some serious charges.
They are.
They are.
And the report dives deep into how deceit played into each of those charges.
Okay.
How Mr. Trump's alleged actions were specifically targeting the normal functioning of the government.
But it wasn't just the slam dunk, right? I mean, presidential immunity had to come into play at some point.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a whole section in the report that talks about this Supreme Court ruling that granted Mr. Trump immunity for certain actions he took while in office.
It's like a legal shield that protects presidents from being sued or prosecuted for certain things they do while in office.
Right.
But that doesn't mean they get a free pass for everything.
Exactly. The report goes into detail about the difference between, like, official and unofficial acts, and how tricky it was to separate the two in Mr. Trump's case.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to untangle a giant ball of yarn.
Right.
That's what the legal team was up against.
So even with that Supreme Court ruling, there was still a lot of gray area.
Tons of it. And the report doesn't shy away from discussing those gray areas.
Right.
Especially when it comes to acts that might fall somewhere between official and unofficial.
It's like the legal equivalent of a philosophical debate. Like, what exactly does it mean for a president to be acting in their official capacity?
Exactly. And the Supreme Court didn't really give a clear-cut answer to that question.
Right.
So the special counsel's team had to grapple with it head on.
Okay. I'm already feeling mentally exhausted just thinking about all of this.
I know. It's a lot to take in, and we've barely scratched the surface.
So I think this is a good spot for us to take a breather.
Yes, we've got tons more ground to cover.
Yes.
And I'm eager to dive back in with you.
Stay tuned because we're just getting started.
We'll be right back.
So we left off talking about presidential immunity.
Yeah.
And how tricky it was for the special counsel to figure out what they could actually prosecute.
Right, that immunity issue was a real legal minefield.
Yeah.
Even with the Supreme Court's ruling.
Right.
There were still so many potential arguments that Mr. Trump's lawyers could have used to try and shut down the whole case.
It sounds like the report spends a lot of time exploring those potential legal roadblocks.
It does. For example, the report talks about how Mr. Trump might have argued that even some actions that weren't considered part of his, like, quote, core presidential duties,
right,
were still part of his official role and therefore protected by immunity.
So he could have claimed that pressuring state officials to change vote tallies was just him, like, doing his job as president.
Exactly, and that was led to a whole new legal battle about what exactly counts as a, quote, core presidential function.
Right.
The Supreme Court didn't really give us a clear definition.
Right.
So it would have been a huge point of contention in court.
Yeah. So even with the immunity ruling, it seems like the special counsel was prepared to fight tooth and nail to prove that a lot of Mr. Trump's actions were fair game for prosecution.
Oh, absolutely. The report talks about how they would focus on Mr. Trump's actions as a candidate,
right,
not as a sitting president, to try and sidestep the immunity issue.
Trying to separate those two roles must have been incredibly difficult.
It would have been.
It's like trying to unmix ingredients in a cake after it's already baked.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And to make things even more complicated, the report points out that the Supreme Court left the door open for future arguments about whether certain types of official actions should ever be protected by immunity, even if they're considered part of the president's core duties.
Wait, so even some official conduct could potentially be prosecuted?
That's the implication.
Yeah.
The report suggests that it would depend on whether the government could prove that prosecuting the president wouldn't interfere with the ability of the executive branch to function properly.
Wow. So this whole immunity question was like a legal onion with layers upon layers of complexity.
Exactly. But there was another major challenge that the report highlights even beyond immunity.
Okay.
Proving Mr. Trump's intent would have been incredibly difficult, even if they could have overcome the immunity hurdle.
What do you mean by intent?
So to get a conviction, prosecutors wouldn't just have to prove that Mr. Trump made false statements or took certain actions. They would have to prove that he knew his claims about the election were false.
Right.
And that he intended to use those claims to overturn the results.
Couldn't Mr. Trump have just claimed that he genuinely believed he'd won the election, even if there was no evidence to support that belief?
He certainly could have. And the report anticipates that exact defense.
Okay.
It goes into detail about how the legal standard for proving intent is very high.
Right.
It's not enough to show that someone said things that weren't true.
Yeah.
You have to prove that they knew they were lying and that they had a specific illegal goal in mind.
It sounds like proving intent would have been a major uphill battle for the prosecutors.
It absolutely would have been.
Yeah.
The report acknowledges that this would have been one of the most challenging aspects of the case had it gone to trial.
So even if the special counsel felt confident they could overcome the immunity issue,
right,
there was still a chance the whole case could fall apart because they couldn't prove Mr. Trump's intent.
That's right. It would have been a risky gamble, to say the least.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential legal hurdles, but let's dig into the specific charges that were considered.
Okay.
And ultimately brought against Mr. Trump.
Sure. As we mentioned earlier, the main charges were conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of an official proceeding,
Right.
and conspiracy to injure the right to vote.
Let's break those down one by one. What exactly does conspiracy to defraud the United States mean?
It essentially means that two or more people agreed to deceive the government or interfere with its ability to carry out its lawful duties.
And in this case, the report claims that Mr. Trump conspired with others to do just that by trying to overturn the election results.
Precisely. The report lays out how this alleged scheme aimed to prevent the government from holding a free and fair election and ensuring a peaceful transition of power, which are both fundamental duties of the federal government.
It seems like the report really zeroes in on the idea that Mr. Trump was intentionally using deception to achieve his goals.
You're absolutely right. The report hammers home this idea that knowingly making false claims was a key part of the alleged effort to stop the government from doing its job when it came to the election.
And they were prepared to argue that Mr. Trump knew those claims were false all along.
Yes, the report goes to great lengths to present evidence that allegedly supports that conclusion. It cites instances where Mr. Trump was directly told by advisors and officials that his claims were baseless, yet he kept promoting them anyway.
It's like they were building a case that Mr. Trump was willingly ignoring the truth to get what he wanted.
That's certainly the impression the report gives. It argues that this deliberate use of false information was a central element of the conspiracy to defraud the United States.
Okay, let's move on to obstruction of an official proceeding. That charge seems pretty straightforward, but I'm guessing there's more to it than meets the eye.
You're right. The legal definition of official proceeding played a big role in this case.
How so?
The report explains that to prove this charge, prosecutors would have to show that Mr. Trump took steps to obstruct or impede a specific proceeding before Congress. In this case, that proceeding was the certification of the Electoral College votes on January 6th.
So the argument would be that Mr. Trump's actions were designed to disrupt that process to prevent Congress from officially confirming the election results?
Exactly. The report points to things like his pressure on Vice President Pence to reject electoral votes and his efforts to create those fake slates of electors as evidence of his intent to obstruct the certification process.
It sounds like the special counsel was prepared to argue that these weren't just isolated actions, but part of a coordinated effort to disrupt a core democratic process.
That's the gist of it. The report lays out a detailed timeline of events leading up to January 6th, trying to show that Mr. Trump's actions were part of a calculated plan to stop the peaceful transfer of power.
And the report even cites a specific Supreme Court case, Fisher v. United States, to support their interpretation of the obstruction charge.
It does. The report explains how the Supreme Court in that case clarified what it means to corruptly obstruct an official proceeding. The special counsel argued that Mr. Trump's actions fit that definition perfectly.
So they were using the Supreme Court's own words to try and build their case against Mr. Trump.
Exactly. They were arguing that Mr. Trump's alleged actions went far beyond simply expressing his opinions about the election.
Right.
They were claiming that he engaged in a deliberate and illegal effort to interfere with a formal government process.
Okay, last but not least, we have conspiracy to injure the right to vote. What can you tell us about that one?
This charge gets to the heart of what it means to live in a democracy. It essentially makes it illegal to conspire with others to prevent someone from voting or to try and prevent their vote from being counted fairly.
And in this case, the argument was that Mr. Trump conspired to disenfranchise voters by trying to overturn the election results.
Right. The report highlights how the alleged scheme targeted the electoral process in key states, aiming to invalidate votes that had been legally cast and counted. They argue that this was a direct assault on the principle of consent of the governed, which is a foundational idea of American democracy.
It sounds like they were saying that Mr. Trump's alleged actions were a direct attack on the very foundation of our system of government.
That's a key takeaway. The report emphasizes the importance of protecting the right to vote and argues that Mr. Trump's alleged actions represented a serious threat to that right. They even cite past court cases to show how seriously the courts have taken efforts to interfere with voting rights.
So they were trying to show that this wasn't just some abstract legal argument. They were drawing on a long history of legal precedent to support their case.
Exactly. They were trying to demonstrate that protecting the right to vote is not a new concept. It's something that has been enshrined in law and upheld by the courts for generations.
Okay, so we've covered the specific charges, but the report also spends a lot of time explaining why prosecuting Mr. Trump was important, even given all the potential legal challenges we've discussed. They argue that it served several substantial federal interests.
You're right. This part of the report is crucial because it helps us understand the bigger picture. Why did the special counsel think it was so important to pursue charges against Mr. Trump, even if it meant facing a ton of legal and political obstacles?
Let's dive into those substantial federal interests. What were the main ones that the report highlights?
The report lays out several, and they're all really important. First and foremost, it emphasizes the need to protect the integrity of the U.S. election process. We're talking about everything from collecting and counting votes to certifying the results and ensuring a peaceful transition of power.
It makes sense. If people lose faith in the idea that our elections are fair and accurate, our whole system of government starts to break down.
Exactly. And the report argues that prosecuting Mr. Trump would have sent a clear message that trying to undermine that process, especially at the highest levels of government, won't be tolerated.
So it's not just about holding Mr. Trump accountable for his actions. It's about deterring future attempts to interfere with elections.
That's a big part of it. The report explicitly states that failing to prosecute Mr. Trump could have set a dangerous precedent, basically telling future presidents that they could get away with manipulating elections.
So it's about protecting the future of American democracy, not just punishing past actions.
Precisely. But the report goes even further. It also highlights the federal interest in making sure that every citizen's vote is counted fairly and accurately.
That's a core principle of any democracy, right?
Yeah.
Every vote should matter.
Exactly. And the report argues that Mr. Trump's alleged actions directly threaten that principle by trying to disenfranchise voters and manipulate election outcomes for his own benefit.
It's like they were saying that he was trying to rig the system to stay in power, even if it meant silencing the voices of millions of Americans.
That's a powerful way to put it. The report suggests that failing to prosecute Mr. Trump for those alleged actions would have undermined public confidence in our elections and made people question whether their votes really mattered.
So the argument is that accountability was absolutely essential to protect the sanctity of the ballot box.
Exactly. And the report doesn't stop there. It also highlights the federal interest in protecting public officials and government workers from violence and threats.
This brings us back to some of the things we discussed earlier about Mr. Trump's use of social media to attack his critics and opponents.
Right. The report provides examples of how Mr. Trump's public statements and actions allegedly led to threats and harassment against individuals who were involved in the election process. We're talking about state officials, election workers, and even members of the Justice Department.
It's a scary reminder of how easily words can be used to incite violence and how vulnerable those who serve in government can be.
Absolutely. And the report argues that prosecuting Mr. Trump would have sent a strong message that such behavior is unacceptable, especially from someone in a position of power.
So it's about setting a standard of conduct for those in leadership roles, making it clear that they have a responsibility to use their words and platforms responsibly.
Exactly. But the report also goes beyond that, arguing that prosecuting Mr. Trump would serve a broader federal interest in the fair and even-handed administration of the law.
That's a pretty fundamental principle, right? The idea that the law should apply equally to everyone, regardless of their status or power.
Absolutely. And the report argues that failing to hold Mr. Trump accountable would have sent the message that powerful people are above the law. It states that allowing him to avoid consequences for his alleged actions could have created a two-tiered justice system where the wealthy and influential get treated differently than ordinary citizens.
That would be a pretty dangerous precedent to set. So all of these federal interests taken together seem to create a strong argument for why the special counsel felt it was important to pursue charges against Mr. Trump, even though there were obvious legal and political risks involved.
I think that's a fair assessment. The report makes a compelling case that accountability was necessary not just for Mr. Trump's alleged actions, but for the health and well-being of American democracy.
So it's about more than just this one case. It's about upholding the core principles that our system of government is based on.
Precisely. It's about ensuring that no one, not even a former president, is above the law, and that those who try to undermine our democracy will be held accountable for their actions.
That's a powerful argument. But the report doesn't just focus on criminal prosecution, right? It also explores some alternative ways to address Mr. Trump's alleged misconduct.
That's right. It discusses the possibility of impeachment, which Mr. Trump had already faced twice during his presidency. It also briefly considers other potential avenues for accountability, although it doesn't go into much detail about what those might be.
So they were looking at all their options, not just rushing to file criminal charges.
Exactly. But the report ultimately concludes that none of these alternatives were adequate in this particular case.
Why did they rule out those other options?
Well, when it comes to impeachment, the report points out that it's primarily a political process, not a legal one. They argue that impeachment wouldn't have addressed the specific legal violations that Mr. Trump was accused of. It's more about holding someone accountable for abusing their power or violating the public trust, not for committing crimes.
So they're saying that impeachment was more about holding Mr. Trump accountable for his actions as president, while criminal prosecution was about punishing him for breaking the law.
That's the gist of it. And the report goes on to explain that even if Mr. Trump had been impeached and convicted by the Senate, it wouldn't have prevented him from being criminally prosecuted later on.
So it wouldn't have been double jeopardy to impeach him and then try him in a court of law.
Correct. The report even points out that during Mr. Trump's second impeachment trial, his own lawyers argued that a former president is like any other citizen and can be held accountable in court.
So they were using Mr. Trump's own defense against him, basically saying that even his legal team acknowledged that a former president isn't above the law.
Exactly. They were trying to demonstrate that there was no legal basis for shielding Mr. Trump from criminal prosecution simply because he was a former president.
Interesting. So impeachment was off the table. What about those other potential avenues for accountability that the report mentions?
The report doesn't go into much detail about what those might be, but it does make a general argument about why criminal prosecution was seen as the most appropriate course of action in this case.
What was their main reasoning?
They essentially argue that no other approach would adequately address the seriousness of Mr. Trump's alleged actions or served those substantial federal interests that we discussed earlier.
So they were saying that this wasn't a situation that could be resolved with a slap on the wrist or some kind of symbolic gesture. They felt that criminal prosecution was necessary to send a strong message and deter future misconduct.
That's right. They argued that criminal prosecution was the only way to truly hold Mr. Trump accountable and show the American people that attempts to overturn an election and interfere with our democracy have serious consequences.
Okay, so they felt strongly that criminal prosecution was the best option, but they also acknowledged some historical arguments against prosecuting a former president.
Yes, the report delves into that debate. It acknowledges that some people believe prosecuting a former president sets a dangerous precedent and could be seen as an act of political revenge, potentially undermining the peaceful transfer of power and creating a cycle of retribution.
So they were aware of the potential downsides and the risks involved.
Absolutely. They don't shy away from those arguments. They directly address the concern that prosecuting a former president could be perceived as a way to punish political enemies or criminalize policy disagreements.
Did they offer a counter-argument? How did they respond to those concerns?
They argued that in this specific case, the severity of Mr. Trump's alleged conduct outweighed the potential risks of prosecuting him.
So they're basically saying that the need for accountability in this particular situation trumped the potential downsides of setting a precedent.
That's a good way to put it. They also emphasized that this wasn't about punishing political differences or trying to settle old scores. It was about upholding the rule of law and protecting American democracy from a very real and serious threat.
It sounds like they were walking a very fine line, trying to balance the need for accountability with the need to avoid actions that could be perceived as politically motivated or vindictive.
It was a complex situation for sure. There were no easy answers.
Okay, so we've discussed the arguments for and against prosecution, as well as the potential legal challenges of actually bringing this case to trial. But the report goes beyond just the legal and political arguments. It also presents a detailed account of the evidence that was gathered during the investigation.
That's right. It lays out a timeline of Mr. Trump's actions in the weeks and months leading up to January 6th, and it provides evidence that allegedly supports the charges against him.
Let's dive into some of those details. What were some of the key pieces of evidence that the report highlights?
Well, one thing the report emphasizes is the fact that Mr. Trump was repeatedly told by his own advisors and officials that his claims of election fraud were false. Yet he continued to make those claims publicly over and over again.
So it's that theme of knowing deceit that we keep coming back to. They're saying that he was intentionally lying to the American people even though he knew the truth.
That's the picture the report paints. It cites specific examples like when Mr. Trump was told by his campaign manager that there was no evidence of widespread fraud. It also points to Mr. Trump's relentless pressure campaign on state officials, particularly in states like Georgia and Michigan, where he allegedly urged them to overturn the election results in his favor.
The report provides specific examples of those communications.
It does. One of the most famous examples is Mr. Trump's phone call with Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where he asked Raffensperger to find enough votes to declare him the winner.
That phone call caused a huge controversy. It was all over the news.
Right, and the report uses it as a key piece of evidence to support the claim that Mr. Trump was actively trying to pressure state officials into changing the election outcome, even though he knew he had lost.
It sounds like they were trying to build a case that Mr. Trump was trying to manipulate the electoral process from the inside out, using his power and influence to pressure those who were responsible for counting and certifying the votes.
That's a good way to put it. The report also highlights Mr. Trump's efforts to assemble those fake slates of electors, which were designed to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the real Electoral College votes and create confusion about who had actually won the election.
That was another big part of the story, right? It seemed like they were trying to create this alternate reality where Mr. Trump had actually won the election, even though he hadn't.
That's a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
And the report suggests that these efforts were coordinated by Mr. Trump and his allies, involving individuals who knew that what they were doing was wrong and illegal.
So they're not just saying that Mr. Trump acted alone. They're saying that there was a conspiracy involving multiple people who were working together to try and overturn the election.
Exactly. They're arguing that this was a coordinated and deliberate effort to undermine the election results and prevent the peaceful transfer of power.
And of course, we can't forget about Mr. Trump's actions in the days leading up to January 6th and his behavior during the attack on the Capitol itself.
Absolutely. The report devotes a significant amount of space to those events, arguing that Mr. Trump's words and actions directly contributed to the violence that unfolded on January 6th.
The report highlights his speech at the Ellipse, where he urged his supporters to fight like hell and march to the Capitol to protest the certification of the election results.
Right, and it also points to his inaction during the riot itself. Even his advisors and members of Congress were pleading with him to call off his supporters and stop the violence.
It's a disturbing picture of a president who seemed to be encouraging the violence and then refusing to intervene when things got out of control.
The report goes even further, arguing that Mr. Trump's words and actions on January 6th weren't just irresponsible, but potentially criminal. They suggest that he may have incited the violence and that his refusal to act to stop it amounted to a dereliction of duty.
It's a lot to take in, and we've only just scratched the surface of the report's findings.
I know. It's an incredibly detailed and comprehensive document.
I think it's time for another break. We'll pick up where we left off in the final part of our deep dive.
I'm looking forward to it. We'll explore the report's conclusions and discuss what it all means for the future of American democracy.
Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive into the Jack Smith report. Okay, so we're back, and I think it's time to tackle the final chapter of this massive report, the conclusions.
Yeah, this is where it all comes together.
Right.
After poring over mountains of evidence and going through all those legal twists and turns, the special counsel had to say, okay, here's what we found, here's why we think these charges are justified.
So it's the moment of truth.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, this report isn't a court ruling.
Right.
It's not saying Mr. Trump is guilty or innocent of any crime.
Exactly. Think of it more like a summary of their investigation.
Okay.
And their reasoning for bringing those charges. It's like the closing argument you'd hear in a trial, laying out the case they would present if it had actually gone to court.
Okay, so what's the bottom line here? What did they conclude?
Well, essentially they argue that the evidence they gathered supports the charges they filed against Mr. Trump.
Okay.
They believe they had a strong case, and that if it had gone to trial, they could have proven that he intentionally tried to overturn the election results.
Okay, but some people might say that Mr. Trump was just exercising his right to challenge the election results. What does the report say about that?
It actually addresses that point directly.
Okay.
The report acknowledges that Mr. Trump had every right to pursue legal challenges, if he thought the election was unfair.
Right.
But they argue that when those legal challenges failed, he crossed the line. He resorted to these unlawful means to try and stay in power.
So they're drawing a distinction between, legitimate political disputes
Right.
and actions that are actually illegal.
Exactly. They're basically saying there's a difference between expressing your opinion about the election outcome and engaging in this, deliberate effort to change the outcome through these illegal means.
And they believe that Mr. Trump's actions went beyond just expressing his opinion.
That is their argument, yeah. They say that the evidence shows he engaged in this pattern of deceit and this unlawful pressure on government officials to try and overturn the will of the voters.
That's a pretty serious allegation. But the report doesn't just focus on Mr. Trump himself, right?
Right.
It also talks about the people who allegedly helped him carry out this plan.
Yes, absolutely. The report actually identifies several individuals who they believe played key roles in this alleged scheme and lays out the evidence they gathered against each of them. It paints a picture of this network of people all working together, to achieve this illegal goal.
So it's not just Mr. Trump acting alone.
Right.
It's a conspiracy involving multiple people.
That is the special counsel's conclusion, yeah. And they're not shy about naming names. They identify people who they believe were involved in pressuring state officials, putting together those fake slates of electors, and spreading all that misinformation about the election.
It's like they're trying to show the full scope of the operation, hold everyone accountable who played a part.
Yeah, I think that was part of their goal. They wanted to kind of expose the whole network and demonstrate that this was a coordinated effort, not just the actions of one person.
So, to sum it up, the report concludes that the evidence supports the charges against Mr. Trump.
Yes.
And that his actions represent this serious attack on American democracy.
That's a pretty accurate summary.
Yeah.
But the report also goes beyond just presenting their findings. It acknowledges that investigating and potentially prosecuting a former president is a really complex and sensitive issue.
Right. This wasn't just your average investigation.
Right.
It was unprecedented in a lot of ways, and they had to navigate some, pretty tricky legal and political waters.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the report spends some time kind of reflecting on those challenges, like we talked about, the whole issue of presidential immunity.
Right.
And how the special counsel had to figure out which of Mr. Trump's actions were protected by that legal shield.
Right.
And which ones weren't.
That must have been like trying to solve a legal puzzle.
Oh, it was. And the report explains how they approached that task. How they interpreted the Supreme Court's rulings on immunity and how they tried to draw a line between Mr. Trump's official actions as president and his more personal actions as a candidate.
So they were trying to be very careful and deliberate in their approach?
Yeah.
To make sure they weren't overstepping any legal boundaries?
Exactly. They knew that every decision they made was going to be scrutinized.
Yeah.
So they wanted to make sure they had a really solid legal basis for everything they did.
But it wasn't just about the legal challenges, right? There were also political considerations to take into account.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The report acknowledges that investigating a former president is inherently controversial.
Right.
And that some people might view it as politically motivated. They knew they were walking this tightrope.
Right.
That no matter what they did, they'd face criticism from some quarters.
It's a tough position to be in. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Exactly. But the report emphasizes that their decisions were guided solely by the evidence and the law.
Okay.
Not by any political agenda. They wanted to make it clear that this was about upholding the justice system, not about scoring political points.
They were trying to defend their actions,
Yeah.
assure the public that they were acting impartially and objectively.
I think that's a key takeaway from this part of the report. They knew that this investigation would be highly scrutinized, so they took great pains to explain their reasoning and defend their decisions. They wanted to leave this, clear record of their process so that people could judge for themselves whether they acted fairly and ethically.
It sounds like they knew that this report would be debated and dissected for years to come.
I think you're right. They weren't just writing for the present moment. They were writing for history, knowing that this document would be studied and analyzed long after they were gone.
Okay, so we've covered the conclusions, the challenges. Now let's talk about the implications of this report. What does it all mean for the future of American democracy?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the report doesn't shy away from addressing it. It lays out these, pretty stark warnings about the fragility of our democratic institutions and the importance of upholding the rule of law.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder, especially after witnessing the events of January 6th. It's clear that our democracy is not as invincible as we might like to think.
Exactly. The report argues that Mr. Trump's actions represent this direct attack on the fundamental principles of American democracy. And they warn that if we allow such behavior to go unpunished, it could set this really dangerous precedent for the future.
So it's a call to action in a way.
Yeah.
It's urging us to be vigilant and to defend our democracy against those who would seek to undermine it.
I think that's a valid interpretation. The report's basically saying, look, we can't take our democracy for granted. We got to actively protect it and hold those in power accountable when they abuse their authority.
And it raises these really important questions about the limits of presidential power and the importance of holding those in power accountable for their actions.
Absolutely. The report forces us to really grapple with this question of whether anyone, even a former president, is truly above the law. It also highlights the tension between, presidential immunity and the need to make sure that those who hold the highest office are held responsible for their actions.
Those are questions that will likely continue to be debated for years to come.
Oh, I agree. The report doesn't provide all the answers, but it does force us to confront these really fundamental questions about how our democracy functions and how we can protect it from future threats.
But the implications go beyond just the legal and political realm, don't they?
Right.
This report also has social and cultural implications.
Yeah. It highlights how Mr. Trump's actions and rhetoric really contributed to this climate of division and distrust in our society. And it warns that this trend poses a serious threat to, the fabric of our nation.
It's a reminder that words have power and that those in positions of authority have this responsibility, to use their platforms wisely and to promote unity rather than division.
Absolutely. The report really urges us to engage in civil discourse, to respect differing viewpoints, and to work together to try and heal the divides that have become so apparent in recent years. It's a call for a return to civility and this reminder that we're all Americans, even when we disagree.
So ultimately, this report isn't just about a legal case. It's a reflection on the state of American democracy and a call to action for all of us to defend and protect the values that our nation was founded on.
I think that's a perfect way to sum it up. The Jack Smith Report is a historical document that will be studied and debated for generations to come. It's a reminder of the challenges we face as a nation, but also of the enduring power of our democratic ideals.
Well said. I think we've done a pretty thorough job of unpacking this massive report.
We did.
But it's a document that deserves, careful reading and consideration. So I encourage you to explore it further and draw your own conclusions.
I agree. There's a lot to digest here. And it's important to kind of engage with these issues on a personal level. This is a conversation that will and should continue long after this deep dive is over.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the Jack Smith Report.
It's been a pleasure exploring these complex and important issues with you.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.